The Equality Court has ruled the old South African flag constitutes hate speech. It has placed restrictions on the use of the flag. The case was brought by the Nelson Mandela Foundation and was opposed by AfriForum. The legal battle was sparked by a 2017 protest against farm murders. Let's listen to a part of the judge's judgment.
Accordingly, the gratuitous display of the old flag constitute prohibited hate speech, unfair discrimination, and harassment. Contrary to the protestations of AfriForum, the relief sought by the applicants in this matter is not a banning order against the old flag. The Mandela Foundation seeks only an order that will declare to all South Africans, including the potential offenders and complainants, that the display of the impugned flag must be confined to genuine artistic, academic, or journalistic expression in the public interest. It must qualify under Section 12 of the Equality Act. Any display beyond that may be brought before this court for the displayer to prove that the display was defensive or to prevail on the court to make an appropriate remedy.
Let's get more reaction to their judgment now. I'm joined now by Hermann Pretorius. He's from the South African Institute for Race Relations. Thanks for coming in, Hermann. Your reaction to that judgment, as we've just heard a bit of it.
Well, I think it sets a dangerous precedent. And I think, let me make clear at the start, that even in the legal arguments, AfriForum by no means talked up the old South African flag. And I don't know a single South African who I think would do that. But from a legal perspective, no, personally, I honestly don't. And I think this whole thing was triggered by inaccurate facts. The reality is that this goes back to the Black Monday protests, where a specific journalist shared a picture of the protest taking place and the old flag being displayed. And it later transpired that that picture wasn't even taken that day at that protest. So the whole thing was triggered by factual inaccuracy, and from factual inaccuracy, we've gone to some very dangerous legal grounds.
Well, you might believe that this specific case was triggered by that specific event, which you are now questioning the facts around it.
I think you even acknowledged it in your introduction.
The issue at fault here is that this is a flag that represents a very, very dark part of South Africa's history. And as much as you might not know somebody who puts this flag on a pedestal or believe that it stands for the good old days, as it were, there are people who live in this country who do wave that flag in memory of the bygone days, of the good old days of apartheid. Surely you will admit that.
Yes, and I think by banning the flag, you're doing them a favor. We cannot...
How so?
Because if a society can be open about symbols, then it can argue the cases behind those symbols and defeat them through reasoned debate, as South Africans have done for a century, bringing about social change and much-needed democratic alignment, even though it took an incredibly long time. But by banning symbols, you are giving these symbols and people who espouse hateful rhetoric and ideology behind that the necessary cover so that their symbols do not form part of the public debate. I am all for getting rid of the old flag. I am no proponent of it. But I think you argue cases better when the other side can actually show up and present their argument, and you can win that argument.
Now, we're sitting around a table and we are able to have a very civil conversation, and we can debate it almost along intellectual or academic lines. But you and I both know that especially the type of people that would put this flag on a pedestal would not want to sit around the table, especially with people of other colors, and would want to have a reasonable debate. They hang on to that flag because it represents a time where white people were deemed to be better than and superior to black people. Surely you would then admit that a judgment like this that says the gratuitous use of this flag is unacceptable at least takes care of the fact that it won't be used as a weapon of sorts to inflict hurt and open up old wounds?
The premise being that I would somehow have insight into the minds of these people who would support that flag, I don't grant.
But from a sensible point of view, we need to know that there are those people out there who do that. We see it on social media. There are dark corners on the internet where these people get together and use hateful terms as if it was 1970s South Africa, and that flag represents all of that.
It also represents a time when liberation movements were banned, where liberation symbols were banned. It's very clear that this nationalist impulse survived the merger of the ANC and the National Party in 2005. The National Party were experts at banning things. It didn't work well for them in the end, now did it?
But now the word banning was not used in this judgment from what I've seen.
Oh, yes, but come on, let's be reasonable. If we're going to speak
But now you're using the term reasonable again.
Yes, I'm moving to your terminology. I admit the parameters of this discussion is reasonableness, and I think I've admitted that from the start. But if we look at this case from a legal perspective, we can leave the politics out of it. I'm not someone who supports that politics, so I don't think I'm the right person to speak to that. But from a legal perspective, this is a very unsound judgment. If you look at Section 16 of the Constitution, especially 16(2)(c), then you get the limitations on freedom of speech being the advocacy of hatred based on certain categories of race, etc. And then crucially, in that subsection, let me read it exactly for you, just to make sure I get it right, and that, so let me read the whole section. The right in subsection 1 does not extend to advocacy of hatred that is based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. Ironically, the Equality Court today interpreted Section 10 of PEPUDA to be more restrictive on the right to freedom of expression, thereby fundamentally legally limiting a right through primary legislative interpretation that is given in a broader context by the Bill of Rights. So from a legal perspective, I think this is an unsound judgment, and from a historical perspective, I think banning has never worked. The swastika was banned in Germany, and as we can see today, racism is rearing its ugly head again. This is no panacea.
And if you use the swastika as an example, it is raising its ugly head, and there are elements across the world that are bringing back the swastika as a symbol of that hatred and that racism.
Yes, a symbol that is banned.
Indeed.
Banning doesn't work.
But I bring it back again, that this judgment doesn't use the term ban. There are people that are saying that it should be banned outright, but this judgment doesn't do that. And if I go to a certain part of the judgment as well, where the judge says the use of a symbol communicates from mind to mind, they communicate just as words do. Words in section 10.1 must not be read literally, but must be interpreted to be wide enough to include expressions of ideas, such as the waving of the flag. And inasmuch as we expect our courts to follow the letter of the law, they also cannot be tone deaf to the country that those laws represent. And if you represent an institution that calls itself the Institute of Race Relations, we cannot just get stuck on the definition of a word like ban or a reasonable. If we're talking about relations between people of different colors, you have to admit that that flag stands for something that can only be divisive between those races that you are trying to get to relate to each other.
I'm not sure I follow your reasoning at the end there, if there was any. The fact is...
I think that's a little bit unfortunate.
But let me answer the question.
Perhaps go ahead and try and explain to that, because you do represent the Institute of Race Relations.
Yes, proudly.
Would you at least then admit that this flag represents the kinds of symbols and words and rhetoric that comes between those specific races that make their home in South Africa, which has a history that is extremely divisive and still inflicts quite a bit of hurt, especially with symbols such as this?
Absolutely. In this interview, I've likened this flag to the swastika. I don't think anyone can accuse me or my institute of considering this a light matter. We just don't think that this is the right way of going about it. There's the rule of law. There is constitutional interpretation. There is the judicial process. These things did not shine today. We are not advocating for the waving of this flag, and we must make this very clear. There's a difference to being in favor of a right and in favor of a practice. We are in favor of a right of freedom of expression. We are not necessarily in favor of every possible manifestation of that right in practice.
But then why leave the door open for the expression of that kind of hate if it's only going to cause hurt?
South Africa has a century of experience of where governments have tried to manage its citizens oppressively by regulating speech, regulating who they can love, regulating where they can stay. This is an ambitious project that the National Party launched and that South Africa seemingly hasn't yet distanced itself from. Might I just finish this point because I do think it's crucial. South Africans are a surprisingly rational people if we get out of the Twitter sphere and if we look past social media.
But unfortunately we can't get out of the
Twitter
sphere.
Let me just finish the point. The fact of the matter is, every societal ill does not require government intervention. That is not how our Constitution is structured. From a legal perspective, there are social sanctions that we, as speaking as an Afrikaner, we have widely accepted the new dispensation.
Well, thank you for doing so.
And I'm proud of that. I have no allegiance to this flag. But the fact of the matter is that we have to acknowledge that if we're going to have freedom of expression, we have to say that there are going to be expressions we find offensive, we find unsociable, we find racist. But that does not mean those things have to be illegal. That is how the National Party achieved the absolute freedom to oppress by removing the freedom of people to really express themselves. And the ANC should know this. I'm not involving them in this court.
The ANC didn't bring down this judgment. It came from the Equality Court.
That's not what I'm saying. But the ANC should know this. Our current government should know this, and they should take heed that the powers currently being given to the government to legislate opinions out of popularity and out of existence is exactly what they fought against.
So you feel like, and in closing, sorry, we do have to go. We could speak for a while about this, and I'm sure our viewers will be for some time as well. If you argue that there's no point in banning it because these kinds of symbols do not disappear, what do we have to gain by not banning it?
The encroachment of freedom of speech, the putting, and let me define that quite clearly. This piece of legislation, PEPIDA, was adopted by 50% plus one of parliamentarians. That means this judgment has just given 50% plus one of parliamentarians in this country the right to regulate your and my freedom of expression.
Well, I suppose as a black South African, perhaps I would have to see it differently, because when you look at a symbol which has represented pain and suffering for generations that have gone before people like
the
me,
communist flag.
It's very... No, I'm speaking about this flag.
Oh, but why not the communist flag?
Can I speak? Because I've allowed you to speak for some time now, Hermann.
There
needs to be an understanding that what this represents as a symbol, in as much as hate speech is constituted and the definition includes words, the symbols need to be included as well. And we've got a government and a justice system that cannot be tone deaf to what that represents. Thank you so much for coming in. With the South African Institute of Race Relations, Hermann Pretorius is an analyst. Thank you so much.